Hi everybody. I'm going to kind of go over some of the same stuff. I think most of the faces here I recognize, so there's some things that I'll go over real quickly. If it's your first time, or if I go too fast, feel free to stop me and ask me to cover it in more detail. I think everybody probably knows by now how we got here, but my elevator summary of that is that the owner of this site was Kerr-McGee Corporation. In 2005, they created a spin-off company called Tronox. They stuffed all their environmental problems into that company, and then they sold that company. And then they sold themselves to Anadarko Petroleum. And then when Tronox went bankrupt because they had all the environmental liabilities. They didn't have enough revenue-generating operations to pay for them. And so part of their bankruptcy settlement created this multi-state trust, which manages hundreds of waste sites. In Region 4, in the southeast region of the EPA, there's 4 sites that they're managing that are associated with EPA oversight. Most of them are like gas stations and things like that are a little smaller. So the multi-state trust funds can be used for the cleanup of the site. The bankruptcy also created some restoration funds for natural resource damages, and that's what we heard about earlier. And multi-state trust has been around since 2011. Okay, so that's the quick summary on that. Any questions on that? Okay, so in terms of the Superfund process, these terms are terms that are in the regulations and the laws. The remedial investigation, like Richard said, is what is it, where is it, how bad is it, what is the risk? Once we understand what the risks are and where the impacts are, then we look at how do we fix it, and that's what the feasibility study is all about. So once we have the ability to try to run those processes alongside each other, so to try to make things go a little bit faster. So we have we started working on the feasibility study after the first draft of the remedial investigation report. The feasibility study lays out a set of options based on what the risks are. How do we fix these risks? And then EPA issues a proposed plan, which presents that to the public in about a 20-page document that is supposed to be a summary. That's short. That's the short version. And then the proposed plan is available for public comment, where we seek input from the public about the proposed cleanup remedy, and we have a formal public meeting with the court reporter, and it's like this, but a little more formal and structured. And then after a public comment period, we prepare the record of decision, which is the legal document where we kind of make the formal decision administratively. That lays out what the cleanup numbers are going to be, what the technologies are going to be, how do we use the technologies, and then the next stage is the remedial design. How deep do you dig in this spot? What's the area of this excavation? What do you do exactly with the dirt? Then the remedial action is where you actually have, the cleanup happening. So the OU1 area, we talked about this a lot. How do we shape this? Because we wanted to make this the easiest decision we could. And at first we were thinking that our OU1 area would be this whole area in the north. And then we decided that we would start with just inside the fence line of the facility. Was the easiest way to make the decision, because we need a little bit more information about some of these drainage swales, and most of this is clean. And we want to maximize the area of the site that if it's definitely clean, we don't want it in the Superfund program. Superfund program has a lot of potential liability concerns for redevelopers, and there's some stigma. And so if we can define the area that's outside of the Superfund program and make it not part of the site, then we're going to do that. So we're starting with what we know is the site, and then we'll do some targeted sampling to work out from that and add it as we need to the site. And then once we have accomplished that sampling, then the rest of it we'll formally say, Superfund site is defined as this area, and this area is outside of it. That should, in that area, there won't be restrictions for the use. There won't be, there won't be a need for land use restrictions or for any kind of cleanup. So we're working on that as part of the strategy. The parts down here are much more complicated because of the technologies and the depth of the creosote that's moved into the ground, 80 feet deep, 90 feet deep, and there's a lot of it there. So that is a more expensive, complicated type of remedy to execute. So that's another reason this is relatively easy. Soil contamination, no groundwater contamination, it doesn't go 15 feet, it goes 4 feet. It's not that, it's so complicated. The marsh is a very small area, but it's a complicated question to decide where you draw the line, where you have to take an action, where you don't really have to take an action. So that's what we're working on now with some additional study. So, we kind of talked about this. We'll talk about, we're going to have remedial action objectives in the feasibility study, which is like the big picture statement. What is the objective of this cleanup? And that's a narrative type of statement. It's not a number. So in this case, we want to prevent the unacceptable risk to humans from exposure to soil with concentrations of these chemicals above a cleanup goal. It's kind of a mouthful, and the attorneys make me put all these little phrases in it. But what that does is it lets us describe, what it is we need to do. We want to prevent exposure to humans above a level that's going to cause a health problem. And so the next logical place we go with that is what's the land use going to be? And as Richard talked about, looking at industrial, commercial land use based on the community input, and some recreational components. That helps us decide where do we need to take an action, where do we not need to take an action. So in the feasibility study, you'll see general response actions, what are kind of the big picture technologies that you might use. And then we'll develop specific remedial alternatives that take different technologies. So a technology would be like, if you excavate some soil, you can dispose of it in a landfill, you can dispose of it on site, you can incinerate it, you can send it for thermal desorption, you can treat it with chemicals, so it's like that kind of, stepwise process to decide what you're going to do with the contamination. And we analyze these remedial alternatives, and then we compare them. And compare them against each other. So right now in the draft we have these remedial alternatives. We're mandated to look at a no action alternative, which is like, okay, if we don't do anything, what happens? And there's still contamination there and you can't use the soil. So that's not acceptable. We'll use that as a baseline. Alternative 2 is institutional controls, which just means you don't do any cleanup, you just restrict the use. And so that's kind of the old, kind of what's been happening so far. Is there's a fence, people can't use the property, don't go on there. That is kind of the least, that's not something we're going to do, but that is an alternative that we have to evaluate. Removal of the soil and an off-site disposal is one option that is being considered, and removal and on-site disposal or consolidation on-site. I think we're going to end up with like some kind of combination of, in some areas we will just apply, if it's just a little contaminated, we may apply institution control that says no residential use. If it's acceptable for commercial use. Then in some areas we may need to dig up that soil. And we may decide, this soil, we'll send it off to a landfill. But we may have other areas where we can excavate to a certain area and then leave soil that's underground and put clean soil on top of it and say, all right, if you dig below 2 feet or 3 feet, then you need to, in this area, you need to sample it again. Or we just say you can't dig here, And that's where, figuring out what the land use is going to be, who wants to build what there, in terms of the future of the property is important, so that we understand if you want to build this kind of building, you might need to dig this deep. If you're going to build a utility corridor, run a water line, you need to go this deep. So we can design our remedy to accommodate those kinds of construction things. So that kind of stuff happens in design. But at the remedy description phase, we want to make sure that we make it flexible so that when we design it, our hands aren't tied. Any questions about this? Okay. So,
I'd like to ask you something about the marsh.
Sure.
Will the marsh be drained off, or going to?
So right now, we're working on just that one area. The marsh is probably going to be something we look at down the road. maybe next year, the year after. But in general, what we have in the marsh, we see there are some areas where there's creosote right at the surface of the marsh, especially like right at the shoreline, there's some. And then out in the marsh, there's some areas that have got creosote right there, percent level creosote. Those situations are probably situations where we'll try to get that out of there. And if we do that, then we will manage that water. But we want to restore it back to a marsh, functioning marsh when we're done. So we don't want to leave it, we don't want to destroy the marsh, save it, you know.
But does that marsh with the creosote in it have microfish?
Yeah, actually, we were out there yesterday, and I mean, there's clams and fiddler crabs in most areas. And that's good. I mean, that means they're able to survive in that marsh. There are some areas where you don't see that, where there's creosote, but for the most part, it's a nice functioning marsh. Mayor Willis, you had your hand up for a minute.
Well, I asked the Queen's permission, is it okay?
Yeah, go ahead, sir, because I know you older, you might forget going.
You got it. So I think it's kind of important at this point to point out to the folk that the marsh that we're talking about is just the marsh that's associated with Sturgeon Creek. We're not talking about marsh associated with the Brunswick River, which is by far a lot larger than the Sturgeon Creek marsh. So you might want to point out on the map which marsh we're talking about so the folks could know that that's the marsh that's associated with the high contamination that we're talking about.
So we
I just wanted to make that point.
like Richard said, we haven't done a lot of sampling, and I think we may have a map that shows the extent, maybe we don't have today. Maybe there's like a 10-acre area where we can detect that there's creosote there, but it doesn't mean there's a problem, right? The area where we've got a high enough level that I definitely think we're gonna take an action is just right here, a really small area, maybe an acre total, maybe 3 acres total. That's kind of what we need to do now. Yes.
So I have two questions. Good evening, everyone. I'm Queen Quet. Did say that wasn't a joke when he called me Queen. I had two questions. One, tying to the same thing that the mayor just pointed out and what you said. Now, you're seeing these creatures there, but have we tested, like any of the fiddler crabs, to make sure they're not mutated versions, like how we have these mutant mosquitoes now after the hurricane? That's one. And then two, in the remediation process, when you bring in the other soil, like you said, you dig down, you remove the contaminated soil, you bring in soil. What's unique, if anything, about the soil that gets brought in these processes? There are certain things that are within this soil that helps with this so-called capping and whatnot that happens with the contamination that makes it healthier. Like, for instance, if we were talking agriculture, someone would say use compost, right, to grow things because healthy is better. It'll, revitalize your field. So is there something unique in any point when we do this type of work that about the soil you bring in?
Right, those are great questions. So back in, I want to say in 2009, we collected samples, or in 2008, we collected samples of clams and fiddler crabs and minnows in this marsh, and we also collected blue crab and catfish, mullet, bass, and some other finfish. And we worked with Department of Health and DEQ and the fisheries folks because they had the boats that could do all that. And so we did a pretty large study. We looked at PAHs for our site, but we also, since we had the samples, we allowed them to do some sampling for metals and some other organic contaminants. I don't recall exactly because I'm focused on the PAHs. And we let DOH have that data. So when we did that, we were looking at, are these animals accumulating enough of this compound that it could be a problem for higher altitude change. So that's what we were looking at. That data has been part of the risk assessment, but the most sensitive critters are not necessarily always those larger ones, but they're the really little mud bugs and things like that. And so we took a set of samples and sent it to the lab, and we did a toxicity test in the lab for 10 days. And we looked at the results, and what Richard was kind of talking about, we saw some toxicity in the most contaminated sediments. And to the point where it was actually a very surprising result in terms of like they were more, they lived more successfully in the sediment than we would expect based on the concentration. And so we are going to verify that result with a 28-day toxicity test. Is most likely the way that we're going to do it. We're still working on the work plan for that.
So let me just extend just for a second. What we did is we went out and got samples out in the marsh. And then we divided them and put 100% contaminated soil sediment in one. And then 75% contaminated, 25% clean.
Okay.
So we had a range and down to 10%. So we had a range of different toxicities. Then they put in special, I think they're clams essentially, that they grow in the lab. They have a control also, and they monitor how well do these grow in these different concentrations. And they look for where is there a point where you can see that there's no effect, no obvious effect to those creatures. And that will help us understand, you know, here's where we have to do something. We have to clean it up if it causes any effect on any of these creatures that we have in the
Okay.
And so we did that, and the concentration levels where there was no effect were higher than people felt comfortable with. So that's what the second set is for, is to really go back there and see, because there's some real positive, there's a very high total organic component in this marsh, and that tends to absorb that contaminate and basically attaches to it. So now the creatures don't have access to that.
Okay, so they're not.
So there are things going on there that are actually beneficial, and we just want to make sure we understand that.
Right, okay, excellent.
Right. So then your second question was about the soil agreeing back in.
Right.
And a lot of that depends on what the future use is going to be. So if we're going to bring in soil and we know that a building's going to go there, we might select a different soil than if we think it's going to be used for trees again or something like that, right? So that's the kind of design, that kind of stuff happens in the design work, because you don't want to bring in like subsoil that doesn't have any organic matter in it and then try to grow, you know, flower bed or trees or grass. It just won't work very well.
Right.
And so that's kind of in the design phase.
Okay.
And if we do remove sediments from the marsh, then, you know, that will be like a designed material would be used to fill that, to try to replicate what the marsh is doing now. Because right now, in the big picture, like what's happening is we have this creosote that is that was released over land, and there's some contaminated water that's probably going up into the creek, not the creek, but into the marsh. And the high organic matter in that marsh is absorbing it up like a water filter, like a carbon filter. And it's keeping it from getting to the creek, which is good. So we want to mimic that function as we don't want to interrupt that. That's a really beneficial thing that's happening.
Okay, excellent.
It's a question back.
Eric, I know you said that there were fiddler crabs and other things at the marsh, and that's a good sign. That also means that it's a primary nursery area. So if you have to somehow or another remediate that, are there any studies as to how long it would take to restore that PNA back into the system? Because so many people here fish for subsistence, and you know, we want to make sure that we're getting, have an idea of how long that might be disturbed.
I think that if, in terms of the time frame for dealing with like a target, like a excavation or a cleanup in the marsh, if we're going to remove sediments, we'll put some sediments back immediately and vegetate it, and so it should be functioning. We would hope that vegetation will be established within a year, and so I think that it would be a pretty quick fix in terms of having it back to a functional state, because it is a living system and you don't want to disturb it. When we did the sampling with the minnows, we have looked at that information, and I think we have that information in the bear. We talked about it a little bit. I don't know off the top of my head exactly what the conclusions were, but the levels that we see in the little creeks are very low. It's mostly in So that's one of the, but it's a very good thing that's happening, where, well, yeah, where there's really high levels of creosote, those are not in the areas where the water's coming out. There's not like an ongoing, you know, sheen of creosote going into the swamp. I mean, I've been out there 3 times, 4 times in like the last 8 or 9 years, and I've never seen, you know, like an oozing seep of creosote. And sometimes that happens at these sites where there's a creek bank and there's creosote in the soil, and you see like creosote going into the water. We don't have that here, which is great. So, so I think that that's a good thing. We want to try to make sure that we keep it functioning that way.
I'd just like to add one thing to that, and that is we are talking about a fairly small area, 1 to 3 acres maybe, probably.
One of the
And
things-
certainly from my perspective, and I push Eric a lot about this, minimal impact there is the objective. You know, we want to make sure that we don't hurt the marsh trying to protect it.
Got it.
Right. So the one other thing about the fish in the marsh is that the fish come and go with the tides, right? So these fish are not in like a pool, like living their whole lives there. We see the minnows come in, and they kind of come back out, and maybe when they come in, they go to a different channel. And the same is true for the larger finfish that are in the surface water bodies. You know, they're feeding along the whole watershed, not just right here in this area. So one of the ways that our evaluation is very conservative is, you know, we like a duck is not going to be able to eat every meal in this little area, right? It's not there all the time. It's going around. But we still use some of those calculations to make sure that we are cleaning it up to a point that it would be safe. So the duck could eat there quite a bit more than it does. So we're making some over-conservative assumptions in some cases to make sure that we're being protected. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question was, from the time you started the project, would you say we on schedule or behind schedule? And if we,
I mean, I would say that the way that I answer that depends on, I would say, how the community feels we're doing, honestly.
That was the original.
In some cases, we go too fast.
Well,
And here we had
This
some
guy
moments
made
where
that back
we
too.
got feedback from the community.
That's
We're
what the
going too
original schedule.
fast with some of these decisions. But at the same time, you know, we want to get it cleaned up as fast as we can. I think that we're trying to move at a pace that is not so fast that we leave the community behind. We want to make sure we have enough time and space for there to be a consensus about what happens at the site in the future. And so, you know, I would like to be much further down the road. And I think that we have to balance that with not going so fast that we leave people behind. If this site was a site where there was ongoing exposure, we could be out here in about 24 hours with machines and people, and we could move really fast. In fact, EPA did an emergency response up at P&W Waste Oil, where we had OSCs out there, and they were done in a matter of weeks and months. And so at a site like this, where, you know, we're trying to balance having that community input, and, you know, this is, when we restore this back to use, it's going to be a part of the community for, you know, the decisions we make now are going to be like 50-year decisions that are going to impact what happens here for a long time. So we want to be more cautious and thoughtful about how we do that. So are we ahead of schedule or behind schedule? You know, we're trying to balance moving quickly with moving in a thoughtful way. Does that answer your question?
because my next question was going to be, the money there is scheduled, the money not there, if we behind schedule.
I'm not sure I heard you. Could you say it louder?
I stated, the reason I'm asking the second part of the question, you didn't quite answer the first part the way I was looking for it, because my next concern, will the money be there when you project the project? And you project 2 years, and you want to be this far, if you overspend the funds, or if you underspend, that's what you
Right. So This site is the benefit of this trust, is a source of a lot of funds to do this. It's not the only source of funds that we'll ever have to do this cleanup. So, one answer is, we're not gonna run out of funds to do a cleanup at this site if the trust uses all its funds. I don't think that we will. I hope that we don't use all this money on this cleanup. I hope there's some money left over. And I think that that is possible. And we have not spent so much money that I have any concern that we're gonna run out of money in the next 10 or 15 years, for sure. I just don't think that's where we're at.
Yeah, I would, part of our job is, a big part of our job is managing the money. And it's certainly mine and the multi-state trust's intent to have money left at the end of this. And I know Eric and I, again, he's comfortable saying that if we run out of money, there's still going to be funds available from other sources to do that. But that's not in my thinking. We're going to get this done with the money we have in the trust.
What happens to the money if there's some left over at the end?
It goes both ways in the sense that the money in the trust can only be used for remediation. And if there is money left in this trust, it will flow to other sites that we have that need money. Now, on the other hand, this site has benefited. Some of those fuel stations that Eric mentioned, we've actually cleaned up and sold and have gotten a net positive return on that. So we got more money back than we spent on the cleanup. And some of that actually has spilled into the Navassa fund. So it goes both ways, but it's within the multi-state trust portfolio, but the money flows to where it needs to go. Yeah.
Isn't there some funds available to support ongoing projects within the site?
Yes. So there is a part of it that is, right now, it's basically we have to get additional approval to use that money, and the intent of that is to have an O&M fund. So if if the remedy requires long-term maintenance, there'll be money in there to cover that. So again, the intent is not for us to just do it and leave, and then the state or someone else has to pick up. David's very interested in this. He has to do the O&M over time. So yeah.
I just want to make sure that they understood that.
Yeah, good. Those are great questions. Any other? Operations and maintenance, yeah. So even if you put a cap on there, you have to go out there and make sure there's not been damage, that it's still intact, might need some repair. In some sites, they actually, pump water and clean up the water. So you need money for long-term operations. Yes, ma'am.
So in any way, do any of these hurricanes and tropical storms negatively impact your process?
In terms of the cleanup?
Yeah, in terms of your whole remediation process, like recently with Florence and Michael, did they have any negative impact on your procedure?
Right. This site didn't have any impacts. Sometimes there are sites that have impacts. I have a site in Pensacola that got a lot of rain. That was probably 6 or 7 years ago. We were in construction. We had a lot of open excavations and a lot of contaminated soil was exposed. And so we had very large pumps and carbon treatment systems so we could treat the water that became contaminated from the rain. Right now, EPA is working on a phosphate site in Mississippi where if it rains an inch, then they have 1 million gallons of water they have to treat. And so we're scaled up to manage that, that problem. One of the, we're accustomed to working in hurricane season, and everybody who lives in the southeast, this is part of our life. And EPA's been working on sites in hurricane areas for a long time. So I feel like in the southeast we're well equipped to manage those challenges.
Eric?
Yes, oh, yes.
Do you have any idea of when you might be able to start doing something that left on the part of the site that's not highly contaminated?
Well, I'd like to be able, what I think we'll be able to do is make the decision on the Upper Unit 1 area, and then within about, which will be in the spring, like, I think, March or April, and then we'll be able to determine how much more land we add to that by the end of next year. And so then we'll kind of have the outline of the area, the OU1 area plus the northern area, and I think we'll try to release that for redevelopment about the same time. And then it's a matter of the marketing effort and the cleanup effort. I think the cleanup, the physical work of the cleanup, will take about 12 months. It might take us 12 months to settle on the design. And then it's just a matter of, you know, how many surprises do we have and how many hurricanes do we have and stuff like that. But I think there's like maybe a 2 to 3 year time frame, I hope, before that part of the site is ready to be
I was young when
back
y'all
to work.
started. I said I was young when y'all started this.
75
So
years.
So I guess the question I got, Eric, the 100 acres that's clean,
Yeah.
what is the procedure for, I guess, releasing that? Is there a procedure that has to happen in order to release that for redevelopment?
Right. So of that, here it is. Some of that land is owned by this includes the wetlands,
I
right? So
understand.
it's about 90 acres of wetlands, 150 acres of uplands total. The whole site is about 255 acres. So this 100 acres that's clean includes this part of the
That's
marsh
gonna be
that's
about
clean.
25 acres wet right there. Out that 100 acres,
About
gonna be
100
about
acres
25
blue.
wet.
And then this area, the yellow, is about 50. This site, the inside the fence, there's about 33 acres or so, 35 acres, something like that. So that like 150 acres is this area here. The part of the marsh is already owned by the state government. All the marsh on all ends is owned by the state government. And this part up here, I think it would just be like a normal property transaction to separate that as a parcel. And that's what the multi-state trust is. That's kind of their specialty, is taking property that has been cleaned up and redeveloping it.
So, but when that gets removed, the 250 acres automatically go down to the Superfund site now consists of
Yes.
100 acres, there, right?
Superfund site, I think in the end will be about 90 acres or something like that.
And then you got another 50 coming up at OU1.
Yeah, I think maybe about 90, we'll see, I don't know.
So the Superfund site's gonna go down quick
Yeah.
to size,
Yeah.
workable
Yeah.
size.
Yeah, when we put the site on the Superfund list, we have the national priorities list, that's the list of Superfund sites. We listed the facility, actually. So the parcel was 250 acres. And then Kerr McGee actually gave the marshes to the state in the 90s. They gave the marshes to the state. But that original parcel was 250 acres, but we just listed the facility. And we don't, like, the Superfund is not a list of pieces of property, it's a list of releases. So like, if there are Superfund releases on a piece of property, it's part of the Superfund site. So even like, under the bridge, there's probably some creosote over there, and there, on the other side of the bridge, there's a little bit of margin that might be contaminated. That's part of the Superfund site in a legal sense. The way we usually talk about it is the site equals the parcel. And so what we're trying to do, this is kind of administrative, like inside baseball stuff, but what we're trying to do is to refocus the definition of the site and really articulate in the ROD, the facility is this, these other areas that are contaminated are added on to the site, and then we can use that to legally determine this is the site, this other part of the parcel is not the site, which will mean that it'll have a higher land value because there'll be less stigma. So that'll make it easier for somebody to redevelop, because if they wanted to go and build, dig 8 feet down and build trenches for their utilities, they can do it without any hesitation about, are we gonna get contaminated soil or not? They won't, because it's not part of the So that, you can tell that kind of stuff gets me excited. That's what we do at EPA. We figure out little complicated problems and explain them to each other all the time.
But realistically, it would go to market at the end of 2019 or 2020.
2020 probably is closer. I think, well, we haven't, I don't know that Richard and I put a time on it like that, but, I mean, I think that that's kind of realistic.
Well, that's,
But then again, so the thing is, we can market it before it's cleaned up.
yeah.
That's the other part, like, if there's a developer who is willing to, has a plan, they're interested in the property, they have a plan that's consistent with the vision that we've all developed together, and they can satisfy the trust needs, and they can satisfy our concerns, and they want to do the deal before the cleanup, while the cleanup is underway, that's fine. I'm not gonna stop that, as long as they meet all the criteria. And that would give us, there's some advantages of that, because then we kind of know, what do you want to put here? Oh, you want a 10-acre, if you need a 10-acre slab of concrete, and that's 10 acres where I maybe don't have to do as much excavation, because there's gonna be a slab of concrete on it,
Well,
you know?
And we have done that. We have sold properties to new owners before the cleanup is completed.
well, the 100 acres is particularly important to, at least in my mind, because of the two owners. And see, the state's got a whole different set of criteria for what they're gonna do and how they're gonna do with the marsh.
The state's not gonna sell the marsh. Yeah.
I understand that.
Okay, yeah.
I didn't know,
Okay.
but I said it's a whole different set of
I
criteria.
know where that was.
I don't wanna buy it, but I wanna use it.
If you wanna use it, then yeah, the state will be happy to take you through the county process, I'm sure.
I'm just looking on what's gonna happen realistically in my lifetime.
How many more years you got?
Ain't that
Count
many?
down. He'll be counting down.
So how many of the 100 acres is actually developed?
Part of that depends on kind of, you know, like, there's a floodplain, right? So we got floodplain issues to where, you know, if you're gonna say out of a 100-year floodplain, then you lose a few acres here and there. I
So
don't,
the range of 10, 20 acre.
I don't know off the top of my head, I would guess 30, 40, 50.
I would guess in that,
That is developable.
Yeah.
And we can market that in chunks. With the web
Yeah,
market.
well, we're gonna market it largely, we're gonna try to get the biggest chunks we can.
They can be pieces.
We still need to work out this plan, but that's the
But we
type
can do
of
it
thing
in
that we'll
pieces.
get. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes you'll have a master developer who will come in and kind of do the big development, and they'll plan on subdividing later on. That's possible.
I mean, if you have, just as an example, if it's an industrial park and they buy the whole 152 acres, knowing that they're not gonna build on all of it at the beginning, they're gonna start with one building and utilities in one place, and then they can very easily grow the project with the information that's available. So I think that from what I'm hearing, easily on that northeast part of the upland, not the marsh, but the upland, is something could happen pretty quickly. Pretty quickly as in, if they bought it next week, with the whole idea next week, they could probably start construction right away.
Well, it needs to be out of, it has to be out
We
of.
want to get, I think we want to use, we use the rod to get it out.
Right, I should have
That's
said
part
that.
of it, yeah, so if that's not important to them, if they don't care if it's in the superfund program, then that's fine. But I think it's worth more if it's out.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
So to tie in with all of that, when do we need to make a decision on one of those so that you can start marketing and knowing where you want to start?
I think, and I'll let Richard talk about this, I think that those concept plan are part of the marketing process.
Yeah.
To the potential developers, and then it'll be refined. So they're not marketing that plan as like a set in stone, you gotta do it this way. This is like, here's the concepts. And what Richard explained.
Yeah, and as we get someone engaged, we're gonna, my intention is, we're gonna give them all four of those. Say, these are the concepts that the community has endorsed. And then when they come up with how they are gonna use it, we'll come back to the community and say, here's what the proposal is.
And I
So
would,
it's gonna be an interactive thing, so that, you know, you'll know what they're planning on doing.
and I would advise any developer, if they ask me to engage the community
Yeah.
pretty early. Yes,
Just a point of order, you've got basically the town council sitting back here. And
yes.
so I think the question is not just the community, but the elected officials are asking from a zoning perspective and a planning perspective, when do they need to be getting to you to say, that maybe two of those plans are no longer feasible based on what we envision for our master use plan or our long use plan. So that's what they're, I think, is where we would go. Am I right, Councilman?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
So the stage that we're at right now is, the trust have just sent the EPA, and the Department of Justice, like, the outline of the marketing plan, right? So we're pretty early in that process. So early, after that, this is not an approval for a development plan, this is just approval for them to hire a firm to do the marketing, right?
Just keep in mind, these guys have to do their land use plan.
Oh, yeah, I understand, yeah. So I think I'll let Richard talk about when they plan to engage the town council, but we're pretty early in that process. Right?
Yeah, we're early, but I would say it's never too soon. So I would, you know, for me, let's talk about it more and set a date where we can come in and sit down and talk about what the plan is going forward. And anything else?
Any other questions?
Great conversation.
30 minutes.